thank you all for joining us today for what I hope is both a very interesting and informative panel discussion. We are delighted that you're here. We're going to try and move quickly through our program so that there's an opportunity for you to ask questions and engage in a conversation with the panelists that we have here today. We are very fortunate in that we'll have two panels, one featuring some youth voices followed by some experts from around the country. But before we go any further, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dan Wilhelm, who is the Vice President and Chief Program Officer for the Vera Institute of Justice. So thanks, Dan. Here, I'll put up here.
Thanks, Christine. Good afternoon, everyone. As Christine said, my name is Dan Wilhelm. I am the Vice President and Chief Program Officer at the Vera Institute of Justice. For those of you who don't know, Vera is a 53-year-old nonpartisan nonprofit organization based in New York City, but now with offices also in Washington, New Orleans, and Los Angeles. For most of Vera's 53 years, we had worked pretty exclusively in New York, but over the last 2 decades have really expanded to undertake a considerable body of work around the country and even some work overseas. And now have major centers of activity on the adult sentencing and corrections world, around immigration and justice issues. We have a center on victimization and safety. We have major projects in substance use and mental health, prosecution, and family engagement. But one of the things that we've worked on intensely in New York City in the early days and continuing there and now around the country has been the issue of youth justice, juvenile justice. And so it gives us great pleasure with the support of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation to be able to put on this series of briefings for Hill staff and members of Congress on the issue, the very important and often overlooked issue of juvenile justice. It's a part of the system that is often ignored by many actors. It's a part of the system that's often misunderstood or not understood at all by many. But it's a vitally important part of the system in that it's often the first step toward further involvement and the many human and fiscal and policy costs that are involved with a young person who begins down this path. So we're honored and thrilled to have such a distinguished panel of youth voices and expert voices to help us better understand this topic today. And we very much appreciate the time that you've all taken out of your very busy schedules. And we know what a busy day and busy week this is for all of you. So we very much appreciate you taking the time. And like me, I hope you're looking forward to what will be an informative, interesting session. And I invite you to attend the others that will be coming up on the calendar in the near future. So I'll turn it back over to Christine. Thanks very much.
So as Dan mentioned, as you came in, we have a flyer outside as the Congress becomes a little bit less active as we go out of this current work period. We have really targeted this conversation as an off-the-record dialogue intended for congressional staff in order to really provide an opportunity for you to hear directly from experts from across a wide range of perspectives who have had contact with the juvenile justice system. Our goal at these briefings is really to encourage more conversations among staff and with these experts. And so we hope you can join us at some of the future discussions. But without any further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce the youth that are here today. I'll apologize up front that, as you can all appreciate, Senator Casey may be on his way over to join us. So if he does, we may take a pause in our program. But let me just set the stage a little bit for all of you here. I am very honored to be able to introduce our 3 youth panelists. To my right is Hillary Transue, who is a young woman from Pennsylvania. She's currently a graduate assistant for Wilkes University, pursuing her master's in creative writing. Hillary has been an advocate for juvenile rights since enduring a brief incarceration period where she was in a detention facility in northeastern Pennsylvania in 2007. I'll let Hillary speak more to the circumstances that led to that situation, but I'll just say for a moment, personally, I had the opportunity to attend a film screening here in the Capitol Visitor Center of the documentary Kids for Cash that was hosted by Congressman Cardenas of California and Senator Casey of Pennsylvania. I'll be honest, because I've now gotten to know Hillary a little bit more, I can say this publicly. I didn't expect to stay. I went to see the film. It was after hours, been a long day. I thought, oh, I'll just stop in for a few minutes. Well, a couple of hours later, it just had such a profound impact on me that I have brought it up in conversations almost every day since we first met several months ago. I really encourage you to take an opportunity to see the film. It's now on Amazon, and it has really, I think, changed the way that I think about a lot of these issues. It's a profound story about what happened with two judges in Pennsylvania and the impact that they had on the lives of perhaps more than 3,000 youth, but at least 3,000 cases that have been since documented. And I will just say, too, that part of the reason why we wanted to host this discussion today is that while this film is very important and Hillary's story is so compelling, I think that it also just speaks volumes about what we don't know, what may be going on across the country, and how often youth may experience injustice. So with that said, I'd like to turn over the discussion for a moment to Senator Casey of Pennsylvania. We're very honored that he was able to take time out of his schedule to join us today, and he's really become quite an outspoken advocate around these issues since he had the opportunity to see the film as well. So thank you, Senator Casey, for joining us.
Well, thanks very much. I'm going to be very brief, so don't worry. Sometimes in the Senate, because we don't have the same rules about lengths of speeches, people get a little worried when a senator gets to a microphone. But I'm going to be brief because the most important thing that will happen today is what we all hear from the panel discussion. And in my case, not being able to stay for the discussion, but for those who are in the room that already understand these issues, this will be helpful as well, but especially if you're new to these issues, I know this panel discussion will help enormously for you to better understand it. I come here today really because of young people and their families in northeastern Pennsylvania that had to struggle with the reality of what our justice system was doing to them. And Hillary is one of the examples of an individual that had to deal with the reality of it. I've dealt with it as a matter of public policy, as an issue that's very important to me, and I know to a lot of other people. But it's a lot tougher to be a witness when you've had to live part of that horror. So I appreciate what Hillary and so many others have done to make days like this possible when we're talking about moving forward, talking about legislation, talking about correcting a problem. I said to a group this weekend, I said, if there is one, not only one documentary, if there is one movie that you see this year, you should try to see Kids for Cash. It is that powerful. It is that significant in terms of what it tells us about a major problem in our system of justice. Sometimes it can vary by county and by state and by region, but if what happened in Luzerne County happens in one other county in the United States of America, that's bad enough. If it happens in more than one, then we all have a lot of work to do. We don't ever want to see that play out again, where young people are the victims of real injustice, not even a deviation, a minor deviation from justice itself. There's a great line from St. Augustine, I don't know what century, and I should find out, but St. Augustine once said, without justice, what are kingdoms but great bands of robbers? That was a long time ago when he said that. It still applies completely and specifically to this problem. When you have a justice system in a county, in a state, or in a nation that robs young people of their, not just their liberty, but robs them of their rights and their dignity and their ability to learn and grow without the impediment or the barrier that injustice created, then we're in a country that isn't doing what it needs to do to make sure that thousands of young people can live a better life. The legislation I'm introducing today will, among other things, I'll just do a quick summary, will prohibit states from addressing status offenses by incarcerating young people, by eliminating a loophole that allows states to place status offenders in detention. And one of the reasons, and I'll go through a couple of other elements to it, but one of the reasons why I believe that the brave witness that Hillary provided and the brave witness of others, that will help us move forward, is because this film tells the story better than any speech, better than any briefing I could do or any other person here, I think, because the film tells it all. But I think in large measure, not only does the film speak for itself, but I think it's the kind of issue that already is and needs to be more the subject of bipartisan consensus. This is one of those, or I should say a set of issues where sometimes the party lines don't matter. Thank goodness. I'll say even better, thank God that it doesn't matter to some people in both parties. So that gives me hope, not the kind of hope that is something we can't achieve or realize, but it does give me a measure of hope that we can move this forward, that the intensity of this injustice, the jarring impact that this movie will have on the country, and already has had on the country, is so powerful that even folks that disagree on 20 or 30 issues can come together and make a change. So we're going to work to do our best to pass the legislation so that we can eliminate the use of the so-called valid court order exception, which is an anomaly and a problem that has arisen, which results in thousands, by one estimate, detaining status offenders over 8,000 times just in 2000 and 2010. One of the most disturbing parts of this whole issue is not just the injustice itself. That's bad enough. That alone should be cause for action and legislation and momentum behind change. But on top of that, in addition to that, you have the darkness that will befall any young person that has to go through what Hillary and others went through, which is the horizon of that person being diminished or adversely impacted because a lot of them won't go back to school. A lot of them won't learn and achieve and grow like they would absent that injustice. Hillary's pretty strong, and I know others here who have been through similar challenges are strong, and you'll overcome. But for some young people, the injustice itself will be the reason that they don't learn and stay in school and achieve and grow and have a full life as we would hope them to have. So we're going to work to get this passed. It's a long process, as you know, to get legislation passed, even legislation that is sensible, that has bipartisan support, and that has a sense of urgency about it, like this does and should continue to have. So I'm grateful you're here today, and I wish I could stay, but this is the last day of this work period, and people are running. I thought it was going to be busy this morning. It got worse around lunchtime, in a good way for me, but it made the day more difficult. But I'm especially grateful you're here, and look forward to working with you to get this passed. But to get this legislation passed, I have more work to do on the ground, not only here in Washington, but to the extent that I can, getting this message out across the country. And your voices and your advocacy and your work allows me to be one of the troopers in that effort. And I look forward to working with you. Thanks very much.
So thank you so much, Senator Casey. As you all know, given the demands and the pressures of particularly a day like today, we're incredibly grateful that he was able to come and join us and be part of this discussion. I think it just really goes to speak volumes about the fact that what happened in northeastern Pennsylvania, I would hope would never happen in this country again. But let's hope that it can be a situation where we can all learn from it today. So with that, I'd like to turn over the conversation to Hillary. And as I said before, Hillary's going to talk about her experience when she was in high school. And I just want to also take a moment to recognize that her mom is here in the front row. And I'll speak a little bit more after Hillary's done about her role and what happened. So thank you, Hillary. Go ahead. You gonna sit? I think you're I think it's on.
Oh, is it? I don't. Hello? Hi. So I will start off by explaining that I was a child, like any other child, a voracious reader and imaginative. I had 3 older brothers who were, they were older brothers. And so I was a bit of a prankster. You've got to keep up with those guys. And I always valued laughter. I love making people laugh. I love to entertain, and I was very much that way as a teenager. And of course, as a teenager, you very much value what your peers think of you. And so we had when I was 14 years old, we got a new school administration member. She was a new vice principal, and she was all about the zero tolerance policies at our school. She was a very stern disciplinarian, and as it turns out, teenagers do not like their school disciplinarian. So she was very unpopular, and somebody posed the idea that it would be quite humorous to make a MySpace page about her. So I decided I agreed. And I made this MySpace page with things that 14-year-old girls normally put on MySpace pages, like she likes to think of Johnny Depp and his tighty whities, just completely silly nonsense. So I was on the phone with one of my girlfriends one evening, months after the MySpace page had been created and long after I had forgotten about it, when my mother received a phone call from a police officer insisting that he was coming down to my house to arrest me immediately. Somehow my mother managed to coerce the police officer into not arresting me, but I was told that I would have to go to juvenile probation and that eventually I would have to go to juvenile court. When we met with juvenile probation, they told me that I would just get probation and not to worry about it. It's not a big deal. And so when the court date came, we arrived at the courthouse. There was a big table, actually, kind of like this one, and some ladies were sitting at it. And I walked up and I said, I'm here for my trial. And they said, "Do you have an attorney?" I said, "No." They slid a paper across the desk and said, "Sign here." At the time, I thought that I said I didn't have an attorney, and so this is how you get one. You sign up for one, if you will. My mother and I signed this sheet, and what we didn't know is that it was a waiver to my right to counsel. I would not be given an attorney that day. When we went into the courtroom, I approached former Judge Chivarella, and his first reaction to me was, "What makes you think you can do this kind of crap?" To which I quickly apologized to the victim. My vice principal was in the courtroom, and I said, "I'm so sorry. I never considered you as a human being, but as an administration member at my school. And, I really didn't think about it." But this apology was not satisfactory. Judge Chivarella said, "Do you remember when I came and spoke at your school?" I said, "No, I don't recall, sir." And he said, "Well, you'll have plenty of time to think about it. Adjudicated delinquent, send her up to fact." Now, a 14-year-old, or I guess I was 15 by then, has no idea what adjudicated delinquent means, but does understand the concept of the bailiff is now grabbing your forearm and dragging you into the next room. I was cuffed to the sound of my mother's wailing, and the bailiff said, "Look what you did to your mother." Really wanted to make me feel bad. That was my first understanding of the juvenile justice system, is that the intention is to make you hate yourself. So from there, I was taken into, while I was still cuffed, a holding cell with 8 other sobbing teenage girls. And you think while you're there, you're 15 years old and mommy fixes everything for you. Whenever anything goes wrong, your mom and your dad, they're there, they have your back. And so the entire time you're thinking, mom is coming to get me. This isn't real. This isn't really happening. Mommy's going to fix this. But mommy doesn't come, and you don't realize that until you're at the new detention facility that has now become your new home. And the 60-second phone call they give you to your parents when you arrive is not satisfactory. It doesn't make you feel any better listening to your mother continue to sob on the other end of the phone as you accept your new fate. But I think that my story, I was only there for 3 weeks, and it was really upsetting. It was really awful. It doesn't matter where they send you, by the way. The facility could be a 5-star hotel. It's the moment the gavel comes down, the moment society decides you are no longer a member. And after returning to society, would you want to go back after they treated you that way? And so I think it's really important that people remember that my case is interesting because a judge took millions of dollars, as it turns out. But the truth is that if he didn't take that money, that no one would ever hear about this, and no one would care about the voices of children or what he was doing to them in his courtroom, because that wasn't illegal. And this happens all over our nation to a countless, to an unfathomable amount of children.
Thank you, Hillary. And for those who have not yet seen the film, just to say for a moment, as Hillary described, what came out from that period where Hillary was separated from her family and locked up in the detention facility. Her mom, who's here with us today, is a real hero because she didn't let it stop there. She got on the phone, called everybody she could, and got a hold of the Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia. And from that moment going forward, managed to blow the whistle on a situation that had been going on for a very long time, in which the judge who sentenced Hillary had been sending kids to detention for non-criminal behavior, in many instances behavior that couldn't even be characterized as illegal. Perhaps in certain instances it was behavior that would be judged because they were juveniles, but even then those were the exceptions. So what has come out since that time is that over 3,000 cases involving youth who spent time in locked up detention have had their records expunged. And in the process going forward, hopefully will be a more fair and effective and legal one in northeastern Pennsylvania. But as Hillary said, it's really the impact these experiences can have on kids who encounter the justice system throughout the country. And with that, I'd like to turn over our conversation to Rufus McDowney, who's a local Washington, D.C. resident. Rufus is a current college freshman at the UDC and a very active member of the D.C. Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services Youth Council, as well as a member of the 2014 Juvenile Justice Summit Youth Leadership Track Planning Committee. He's actively involved in this community, and maybe some of you that live on the Hill or live in D.C. may be familiar. He's also a peer educator for the Sasha Bruce Youth Work Teen Outreach Program at Ballou Senior High School. Rufus is going to talk a little bit about his own experience. I would also just acknowledge, though, too, that Rufus, at the age of 16, was also featured in another award-winning documentary, 180 Days, A Year Inside an American High School. And so we're very honored to have him here today, as well as Ruki Wilson, who's here in, where'd she go? Oh, in the back row. I was looking for her. So Ruki is one of the advisors for the Youth Council at the Department of Rehabilitation Services here in the district. The Youth Council is a community services-based group, but I'll let Rufus speak to it more in his conversations. But It's really, it's a partnership that is very admirable between the government working with young people to try and come up with some positive solutions. So Rufus, thanks for joining us. You're welcome to either speak at the podium or where you're at, wherever you feel best.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rufus McDowney. I stand before you today as someone who has successfully transitioned from DYRS's Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services to a successfully enrolled college freshman. I grew up in Ward 1 and graduated from Ballou Senior High School. I am now a college freshman at the University of the District of Columbia and plan to major in criminal justice. I live independently and am currently employed as a youth facilitator for Sasha Bruce Youth Work. As a representative of the district youth, and like many other young people here in the district who are exposed to daily challenges and obstacles of getting to where they want to be, exposed to risks and barriers they may not yet be able to deal with. It's hard. Even though the justice system is here to help, it can sometimes be a barrier. It can sometimes be overwhelming, having to juggle school, home life, extracurriculars, and then some requirements of being committed to the juvenile justice system. It was hard at times. However, whatever struggles I encountered, I was supported with individuals and programs to meet my needs. For example, I was given a tutor to help with school. I was given a mentor to help with life skills. I was also given the opportunity to transition into living independently in my community. I am now a part of DYRS Youth Council, where I do a lot of volunteer work in the community and speak on behalf of other young people in the juvenile justice system. I am the DYRS Youth Representative on the planning committee for the upcoming Juvenile Justice Summit, where we are learning to find our voices and enact change. We, the youth, have the capacity to enact change and will enact change. But we need people such as yourselves who have the ability to change laws and policies on our behalf. It will behoove you to support more independent living programs which teaches teens life skills, money management, and how to live independently in their communities. Upon completing my degree, I hope to give back to my community and work for a place such as DYRS, Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services. I want to show younger people that there is a path to success if you are willing to dream, think big, beyond your circumstances. Once again, I am Rufus McDowney. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rufus. And I'll just say briefly that Rufus and Ruki do a lot of their work in Anacostia, but DC has also opened a new family engagement center in Chinatown, right near the metro, an area where I think a lot of you probably spend some more leisurely time when you get out of these buildings. And so we're hoping to do a visit there during the October period when things should be a little bit quieter here for staff. We're working with the DC government on the details, but you may hear from us about it, and I hope that you have a chance to go see and learn firsthand about some of the programs that are happening here in DC to support our youth. So last, I'd like to introduce Markel Chianti, who his story has yet been turned into a film, but I suspect maybe one of you enterprising folks here may work with him going forward. Markel came up from New Orleans to join us for today's discussion. He grew up in a tough neighborhood, and we're very fortunate today that his mom is here with us as well. I'll let him speak about his experience and what his perspectives are on the challenges that he has overcome. But I'm really delighted to also share with you that Markel has been a participant in a program that Vera has initiated in New Orleans with support of the Department of Labor called the Youth Futures Initiative. And it's part of the Youth Empowerment Project in New Orleans. Through this program, Markel graduated, and he'll talk to you a little bit about the skills that he gained there. But it's really exciting because it presented a new path for post-secondary options, and Markel has told us that he may pursue a career as a welder, which I think is a very practical livelihood. So with that, Markel, we're going to turn it over to you. You want to stand? Come up. Come up,
How y'all doing today?
Good.
My name is Markel Chianti. I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana. I was raised mainly by my mother with the help of my grandparents. I grew up in the St. Bernard Project in the Southern Ward of New Orleans. As a kid, it was not the best place to grow up. Because there was a lot of crime, drugs, and killings. It was too easy to get in trouble, especially when everyone I hung out with was getting into trouble. Before I became involved with the juvenile justice system, I was arrested once before with my big brother for an armed robbery charge. I was released because my brother took the charge. Even though I had beat the charge, I still did not stop getting into trouble. I think the reason I became involved with the juvenile justice system because I looked up to my big brother. I wanted to follow his footsteps. We did not have a lot of things to do or places to go, so we hung out in the streets. When I was in jail, we took regular classes like math, English, and science. I liked learning about science because it was my favorite subject. But you cannot really learn anything in jail because there was too much going on. When we were locked up, we were separated in our cells, but when class came, they put all us together. So dudes was always fighting. A lot of times it was just because what city you from. Instead of sending kids to jail, I think they should give something like house arrest. Going to jail only makes kids worse. It teaches them how to be better criminals. I hate being locked up. It was hard to be away from my family and away from home. I was used to being more in a mixture of crowd with boys and girls instead of just all boys. If life had been different and I have never gone to jail, then I would have never gotten into trouble because once you're in the system, it's hard to get out. After getting out of jail, it was hard trying to get back in school, looking for work. It was hard staying out of trouble and getting my family to trust me again. One thing helped me a lot was referring to a mentoring program called Youth Future Initiative. The program helped me learn soft skills. It also helped me to think better about situations and get along with others. My mentor, Mr. Bree Johnson, taught me how to fill out a job application, so she also taught me how to think positive and to think more about the future. If I did not have this program, I think I'd be back in jail.
Great job, Markel, all of you. So I do want to recognize that Shabri Johnson, who Markel mentioned, who's a program coordinator and senior youth advocate at Youth Futures Initiative, is here with us today. She came up from Louisiana with Markel and his mom. She has a very impressive background on her own, growing up also in New Orleans. She has a BA from Dillard University and a master's of social work from Southern University of New Orleans. She has a lot of experience working with kids. And after Hurricane Katrina, she spent almost 6 years in Dallas, Texas, where she worked to provide supportive services to families through the Department of Health and Human Services before returning home to New Orleans. So thank you also, Shabri, for being with us today, as well as your ongoing work with young people like Markel. So I just want to take another minute to acknowledge how brave and eloquent our youth panel has been in presenting their stories here to a room full of strangers today. So let's just take another minute to give them a round of applause. It's not easy. So I think before we transition to our panel of experts from across the country, I'll just open it up for a moment to ask if anybody here has any questions for our youth, keeping in mind that we would just ask that you introduce yourself, and even though we are filming this event just for Vera so that we can capture what our panelists' remarks are today, that this is an off-the-record event. So you're welcome to ask any questions that you may have right now of our panel, or they'll be available after the next presentation as well. Questions? Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Alex Zama from Congressman Perlmutter's office, and my question actually is directed at Rufus. Rufus, you mentioned several times about living independently, right? That you needed to learn to live independently. I'm curious if you could elaborate on that a little bit more. What was the disconnect, I guess, from living independently and what you wanted to learn, or what you'd already been doing and what you needed to learn?
Good question, Alexandra. The big difference between it is once you're taken out of your community, away from your family, it's hard to pick up on life skills and everyday necessities and things that you need to do in order to have a successful life. For a simple example, getting an ID. Me personally, I didn't know how to get an ID when I was of age to get one, and that was something very small but an everyday needed thing. Needed for life, as well as money management, time management, organization, hygiene. I mean, everyday necessities needed in order for youth to be the best that they can be. Independent living is something that we all have to do at some point, and need to be taught at some point. Being away from your community, your family, your support system doesn't allow you to do that. It doesn't allow you to pick up on those things, those very needed things.
Well, thanks, Rufus. And I think it's, an important reminder that, everyone comes to work here in the Congress from different parts of the country and different life experiences, or some of you may have grown up around this area. Sometimes, kids are born into situations that they have no control over, and maybe without the caregiving support that is needed in order to kind of learn a lot of these things that they may learn at home, and to have the networks available throughout the community to be able to really function on their own once it's time. So I think that, as Rufus has described, one of the things that Vera's project in New Orleans is also doing with young people like Markel is to find ways that not only after overcoming some of these challenging experiences and ending up having contact with the justice system, that there's also a path to employment and a path to the kind of skills that they need to be able to live in their communities and to earn a living, and that benefits all of us when they're in an employed job or have employment. Do we have any other questions for our youth panel? But we'll also, what we want to try and do too is to keep moving, because they'll be around for conversation if you'd like to approach them one-on-one after our formal presentations here. So not seeing anyone, let's just give these folks one more round of applause. Thank you, Markel. We're going to do a quick transition. And while our bodies are moving so we can keep things going here quickly and mindful of the demands on all of your time, I'm going to just start to introduce our expert panel, and our young folks will be around here for a little while as well to answer questions. But to just again, no greater spokesperson than Senator Casey saying earlier, if you haven't seen it yet, try and check out Kids for Cash, maybe on a Friday or Saturday night. So without further hesitation, let me start to introduce our panel. To my right is Vidya, a terrific colleague of mine from Vera's office in New York. She's the project director for Vera on a number of projects within our Center of Youth Justice that Dan Wilhelm described. Currently, I just want to make sure we had a seat for Mark. Her current projects include Youth Futures, a project funded by the Department of Labor that aims to improve the labor market and education prospects of youth, as we've mentioned, in New Orleans, but also in Chicago and Los Angeles. She also directs our Status Offense Reform Center, an online resource center that helps jurisdictions respond to youth who commit status offenses outside of the formal court system. We've been using that lingo a lot of status offenses, and Vidya is going to help us understand what that means. She's lived in D.C. before. She actually got her bachelor's from Northwestern, but then spent some time here getting her master's degree in public policy from GW. After Vidya, we'll hear from Dane Bolin, who's the assistant administrator for I can't. I'm not from New Orleans, from Louisiana. It's just too embarrassing. So I'll let him say it for me. But we're thrilled that he's here to join us because he's had a wide range of experience working through the system. A Navy veteran, Dane had attended McNeese State University and then went on to serve in the Louisiana Army National Guard. He then spent some time working as a juvenile probation officer, and I think he'll speak today about his experience working as the Director of Detention Services within the parish. In 2001, he was promoted to be the Director of Juvenile Justice Services for the entire parish, and he's been recognized on a national level for the work that he's done there to reform the state's practices toward youth. Deborah Fowler joins us here today from Texas Appleseed, an organization that promotes social and economic justice by using the skills and resources of volunteer lawyers and other professionals. She'll speak a lot about their direct work in the field in Texas, but I would just like to emphasize that, she has become a nationally recognized expert in school discipline and juvenile justice issues, having authored 3 major reports on the school-to-prison pipeline in Texas. She has a BA from Tulane University and a JD from Lewis and Clark. You'll see as I continue through our introductions that we have a strong New Orleans theme throughout all of our panel today, although Mark and I may be the exception. Thena Robinson-Mock is the project director of the Advancement Project. She'll speak to their work there, but I would just emphasize for all of you here today that their work is just really outstanding in leading the conversation around how to end the school-to-prison pipeline. Thena herself also worked as a staff attorney in the New Orleans office of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and she has done direct representation of youth in juvenile court and school discipline proceedings, as well as civil rights litigation. She is a graduate of Hampton University and Loyola University New Orleans College of Law. And then finally, again from Texas, Mark Levin is the director of the Center for Effective Justice at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, unless you think we were too focused on just a couple of states. Mark also leads the national conversation among right on crime. That maybe you could speak a little bit about, Mark, today about who those folks are. The foundation is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research institute that has the mission of promoting and defending liberty, personal responsibility, and free enterprise. You may have seen Mark up here before because he's frequently called upon to testify as an expert here before Congress. He was a law clerk to Judge Will Garwood of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit and was a staff attorney for the Texas Supreme Court. Mark, the exception on our panel today, is a true Texan, UT graduate, and also got his law degree from UT Law School. And the copy of Mark's report that he'll speak about was on our panel, or at our front when you came in this morning. If you didn't pick it up, or this afternoon, if you didn't pick it up on the way in, be sure to grab a copy on your way out. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Vidya. Thanks.
Great. Is this on?
It's on.
Oh, it's already on. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Thanks again, Christine, for that introduction, and also to our youth panelists for such a great intro to this panel. My name is Vidya Ananthakrishnan, and I'm a project director at Vera Institute's Center on Youth Justice. And just for those of you who don't know so much about our Center on Youth Justice, we work with policymakers and practitioners who want juvenile justice to be rooted in the community, more effective and smaller in scale, and touching the lives of fewer children. We do this through a number of different projects that focus on both research and technical assistance, which we generally provide to government partners. And while we focus on several different points within the juvenile justice system, status offense reform has been central to our work and close to our hearts for the last 12 or so years. So what exactly is a status offense? That terminology doesn't really mean a whole lot to many people, mostly because it really doesn't tell you what we're talking about. Basically, what we're describing are non-criminal behaviors that are prohibited by law just because of a young person's status as a minor. So the ones that you often hear and see in statutes, both in the state statutes as well as at the federal level, are things like truancy, running away, liquor law and curfew violations, and the best term of all, ungovernability, which pretty much can define almost any behavior that an adolescent is experiencing during that time. And states really can vary a lot in the terminology that they use for their status offense populations. Some of the common terms that you might have heard include things like persons in need of supervision, or PINs, children in need of services, CHINs, families in need of services, FINs. So there's just a pretty wide range of these different terms, and they're all sort of generally referring to this population. And while we're going to talk a little bit more in detail with the other panelists about what's going on both
in sort of different local and state jurisdictions. We just wanted to also sort of start here with some of the federal context. Under the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, which governs the administration and implementation of most of the federally funded juvenile justice initiatives, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, or OJJDP, really has the primary responsibility for monitoring compliance with some key requirements that for states who receive money from OJJDP, they must fulfill. Among those big requirements is the deinstitutionalization of status offenders provision, which states that youth who are charged with a status offense can't be placed in secure detention or locked confinement. This amendment, or this provision, was actually later amended with what was called the valid court order exception. And earlier, Senator Casey referenced the valid court order exception, which basically enabled judges to place young people who were found guilty of a status offense in detention if they were deemed to have violated a court order. So if a young person was sort of told that they needed to attend school as part of their court order and then turned out that they didn't, they could then be locked up in a secure detention facility. In the fiscal year 2014, about 27 states were using the VCO to detain status offenses, so it was happening somewhere upwards of around 7,500 times around the country. So, you know, it kind of speaks to some of the issues that were laid out by our youth panelists about why status offense reform is really needed. And the bottom line really is that these are behaviors that aren't even really crimes, and that, you know, having these cases end up in court is really not an effective or efficient way to handle them. The most recent national data that we really have available is from 2010, which is not that recent. But at that time, 137,000 cases were brought to court, and over a third of them were for truancy. And keep in mind that number, it's not very big, and it probably doesn't capture the full extent of the issue, but that's sort of the number we have and what's being reported. And in about 6,000 of those cases, young people actually ended up spending time in a long-term residential placement facility for their offense. In a time when we're all thinking about how to manage, you know, very limited fiscal resources, really thinking about the approach to these young people in particular is really, really important, and preventing them from really entering the juvenile justice system should be a priority. The way that we respond to these young people can really set the tone for how we're handling future delinquent offenses and sort of set the tone for the juvenile justice system as a whole. Thankfully, and I think you'll hear more about this today from the other panelists, a lot of states and localities are really working hard to move the dial and try for a better system. And much of that work was spurred on by some of the great work that happened through the MacArthur Foundation's Models for Change initiative, which really helped to accelerate the pace of reform and bring status offense reform to the forefront. And really at the core of this is about sort of changing the paradigm of how we view kids and families in this part of the system, and thinking about how we can devise some mechanisms that really keep them from ever getting into court, being able to deliver really immediate responses when they're experiencing some kind of family or personal crises, being able to then effectively triage and diagnose their problems through some screening and assessment, and then being able to offer some pretty timely community-based services where they can kind of get the help that they need without ever becoming more entangled in the system. And a lot of this is centered around, you know, when those approaches have been implemented and sort of driven by a collaborative, data-driven, very community-responsive approach, it's worked really well. And so, you know, I leave you with the importance of really thinking about how we can do this more effectively. And I think Dane and others will speak to some of what they've done on the ground. So I'll turn over to Dane. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Dane Boland from Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana. It means crying eagle. You have to say it very fast in order for it to make sense. It's a population of about 200,000 folks. I had a great day so far today. I got to meet, I think, 3 of the experts in our field, the 3 young folks who spoke earlier. I don't know if I take offense at being called an expert. I think when you're called an expert, you have to get that knowledge from somewhere. So I would call our parish close to being an expert. One thing that we have in our parish, we're very coachable. And the reason we're coachable is because many years ago, and I say many, it's not that long, 1999-2000 era, give or take a year, our parish placed over 120 kids with the Department of Corrections in the state of Louisiana. Now, I'm not very proud of that, nor do I sit in front of you, and I will admit that I am not a hypocrite, because I was part of that process as a very young probation officer who knew no better. Since that time, we have really improved in our services. We're not there yet, but we're very coachable, and we've had folks like Vera and MacArthur and the Casey Foundation and the Children's Center for Law and Policy come into our parish and really assist us in what we're doing. Very proud of that fact. We haven't placed a child who has committed a status offense with the state in over 7 years. We do not do, I would say, hardly 0 adult transfers. I think we've had 2 in the last 10 years. So again, expert, I don't know. Parish that is coachable, I would say yes. So what do we know? We know jurisdictions across the country treat status offenders so differently. Some use a lot of court intervention, Some use a lot of community service programs. They run the gamut of entire ways they handle these folks. One thing we also know that the juvenile justice system was once created to separate the way you handle juveniles and adults. There is no doubt that as you travel across the country, maybe in your communities, we have adultified the juvenile system. That's not my term. I use it for folks much smarter than we are, than I am. But you can see that quite often around the communities. They treat the adults or juveniles the same as they treat the adults as they go through that process. We continue to allow our families get into a system that is so tough to get out once you're in. I think if you look at the research, I say tough, it's almost impossible once a family moves into a system to get out. And we all know that the incarceration of status offenders and low-level, I say risk, it's needs children, is really a counterproductive in what we're doing. Once you replace these kids in these systems and you remove them, they haven't been home for a while. So how do you integrate those back into the community? And so there's a lot of things that happens after the fact that most people do not realize. So why do youth commit these status offenses? I think truancy, ungovernable, by the way, I think I'm an ungovernable adult sometimes, just to let you know. But I think there's a truancy issue, a curfew. Those are some of the reasons why, or some of the status offenses. Some of them we know commit status offenses because of trauma or past experiences. But I will tell you, most of the offenses that are, I guess, delegated or called status offenses is because that child has made an adult very angry over the time, and therefore that adult, whether it be a parent, the court system, police officer, the school, will now define that youth as an ungovernable. So as we continue to look at why adolescents make the decisions we do, we might want to kind of take a step back and think, why do adults make the decisions that they do when it comes to status offenders? I think we get caught up in the youth decision-making skills, and sometimes we don't look in the mirror. And again, I'm one of them, so I've got to step back and do that. So why do all of these adults make these less than average decisions? I'll put it very nicely. I would probably suggest that they're not all inherently evil. So I do not sit here and think that everyone who makes these decisions or systems that make these decisions are evil. I think a lot of the folks who make these decisions are because they just think they're trying to help the family. So if they can get them into court, they can get them into the system, they'll get the services they need, but that is not appropriate, as we all know. I think many of them, and especially dealing with our community, they do not have alternatives. They don't have the tools in their toolbox, the resources for those families. So what do you have left? If you only got one option, it's option A, and that's where they go. And many jurisdictions and folks making decisions confuse needs with risk. That's a constant we find across the country. It's a constant we found early in looking at our services that we delivered. So how do we continue on to make changes for the better. I think we all should go back or think about all of the decision points along that timeline of when the first point of contact is with that family or youth. That first point of contact could be school, it could be law enforcement, it could be a parent that would do it when they refer that child to services. Communities need to be involved in the process, look at the decision points along that timeline and say, what can we do better? I think implementing alternative programs are key. Mentoring programs have been shown that they work very well with dealing with systems, children who do not need to be into the system. Shelter care options, crisis intervention options, and also using more evidence-based screening and assessment tool, which we've had started using quite often. So now it gets back to Calcasieu Parish, an example, how do we go about fixing our systems? Well, we formed a partnership, and I know you hear about that quite often. You've got to form a collaboration or the partnership. But I think we formed a very true partnership. We got in a room. We had teachers. We had judges. We had district attorneys. We had law enforcement. We had parents. We had community providers. We all agreed on one thing, and that is what we were doing was not working. Now, some agreed because it was the right thing to do to change the system. Some of them agreed that it was, hey, you know what? We could save a lot of money if we changed the way we were doing, change the system, because it really not very efficient. It's not very effective. The results are not where we want to be. To me, to be honest with you, I did not care. As long as we could agree on that one thing, and we did. So what do? We sit down and we looked at our decision points. So like I talked about a while ago, I think that's extremely important. And we looked at that first point of contact. How do youth continue to come into our system? And once they get into the system, it snowballs out of control, and the next thing you know, they end up in court. And then when you go to court, you give the family 10 things to do. They have no transportation, or they don't have knowledge, or they don't have the resources to do those things, and they end up back in the court system. We knew that was one area we had to really think about. So we started really focusing on the right kids. So driven by the data and the folks in the room, parents, teachers, we opened up what we call a multi-agency resource center. Now, the MARC is different. We take all kids at the MARC for any reason, not to deepen them into the system, but to provide assistance to whatever that may be. We do a lot of screening. Parents come in and say, look, you know what, I'm having a bad hair day. We're not getting along. Can we just talk to someone? Yes, go in there. We don't need a record of it. Come on in. I think it's very important to do so. We also realized that that first point of contact wasn't happening 8 to 5 while we were at the office. At 5 o'clock, it seems that there were much more reasons to need our agency after 5 o'clock and on weekends. So we ditched our whole entire work schedule. Now, that wasn't very popular among my agency, by the way, but it really did not. It was okay. So we work now. Our MARC is open 6 days a week till 11 o'clock at night. We were thinking about opening up 24 hours a day. And so we could go and help those families when they came into our system. And again, most of the time when families come in, it was a little bit of crisis intervention and go about your way. We did not want to get overly involved. That one-time contact has chosen as something we chose to do and has worked out extremely well. Families sometimes just need a little direction or assistance, or just not, it does not matter. We try to help them out with whatever their needs are. Since the first year the MARC is open, less than 4% of our kids have been petitioned to court for status offenses. So 96% of our kids for status offenses never see the inside of a courtroom. We're very excited about that. Our numbers continue to improve. When I told you a while ago we got partnerships, I got to tell you a quick story. This is the reason why I tell you it's a story, because it's hot off the press as of last week. Part of our partnership or collaboration was law enforcement, obviously. Our chief of police is a pretty big, tough guy. He's also a retired FBI agent, very stern, very get him off the streets, put him in lockup. He's been that way for years. Since we started partnership with the chief, and that's what I called him, hey, chief, he's just a great guy now. He has really taken on this as a passion. He spoke on a national webinar last week on why not to detain status offenders. The front page of our Lake Charles American Press, where I'm from, last Monday was the title, Chief Speaks Highly of the Mark, or Chief of Police Speaks Highly of the Mark. And I'm proud of him. I'm proud of his department. He has realized that it's the right thing to do. It used to be about the financial aspect of it, but now it's the right thing to do. So I'm very proud of him, and I had to mention that today. I'll leave you with this. I know my time's going over. I'll leave you with this. A lot of discussions came up when we're looking at our systems, and we couldn't agree to disagree on a lot of things. We always had one question we threw around the table. If it was your child in the system, what would you want? And every time we asked that question to all of our partners, we usually ended up at the right answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dean. So I just wanted to pause for a moment, and I think that Dane uses this term of art so well in his remarks about the first point of contact with the justice system. At our next briefing on October 9th with support from Senator Whitehouse's office, we'll be having a briefing here over on the Senate side about the developments that have happened with risk and needs assessment tools that jurisdictions can use to provide an objective intake whether it's a law enforcement officer, someone else is having that first contact with the youth and trying to make a determination of what the right path should be. I also just wanted to highlight, some of you were with us for our first discussion a couple weeks ago around adolescent brain development and the research that has developed and the science that is now available in the field for how we think about these issues. So if you think about it as a national problem, you know, it's really interesting that the Supreme Court has changed a lot of its thinking around these issues based on a lot of that scientific research. And even states like Texas have done a lot to change the way that they respond to youth. So with that, I'm going to turn the panel over to Deborah to speak for about 5 minutes, followed by Mark, and then we want to try and open up a conversation that will be led by Thina, whose work with the Advancement Project really presents a great perspective on the national implications of a lot of the policy issues that we've talked about today, and what are some of the solutions that can be led by at the federal level. So, Deborah, go ahead.
Sure. Is that?
I think it's on.
Yeah. So my name is Deborah Fowler. I'm the Deputy Director of Texas Appleseed, and as I said this morning during our morning briefing to Dane, if Calcasieu Parish is an example of what's of the right thing to do for status offenders, Texas is, oh, that's better, yes. Texas is clearly an example of the wrong thing to do, unfortunately. We've made great progress in other areas in juvenile justice reform. Mark and I have been partners at the Ledge during session for several years now, and Texas has done a great job of moving away from use of incarceration for kids who commit more serious offenses, but our status offender system, particularly for truancy, is incredibly broken. So I'm going to tell you very quickly about what's a little different about Texas, and then I'm going to tell you about what I see as common themes between Texas and other states and the way that we struggle with how to effectively address the problems that kids are having when they're truant from school. That's the focus that we've had at Appleseed when it comes to status offenses. So what's different in Texas is that back in the early 90s, when everyone was worried about the oncoming wave of juvenile superpredators that we were all expecting that never materialized, we took all of our juvenile Class C misdemeanor cases out of our juvenile courts and placed them into adult criminal courts. And so all of our juvenile Class C offenses are actually processed through our justice and municipal courts as criminal offenses rather than as juvenile offenses. That means that for any child who is charged with a Class C, that they go through a system where they are not entitled to appointed counsel and where they end up with a criminal conviction that can have all of the attendant consequences when they go out and they try to find a job or try to rent an apartment or try to enlist in the military later in life. Failure to attend school in Texas is a Class C offense. It's also a CHINS offense, but it gets charged overwhelmingly as the Class C, mostly because it's a lot cheaper to do so, and there's a lot less pushback from that side of the system. The courts that process the cases in Texas are made for speed. They're the courts that handle our traffic traffic tickets. And so in Texas, last fiscal year, we had over 100,000 failure to attend school cases filed. It's an incredible number, and it dwarfs the number filed in all of the rest of the states combined. So that is what is different about Texas. That's the oddity of the system. But what is the consistency that I hear when I talk to advocates from other states is that the system's very punitive. It tends to treat all of the kids who come through the system as though they are offenders who need to be punished, rather than looking at whatever the underlying cause of their truancy might be and trying to address that underlying cause. It's also a system that's very inflexible. Those of you who read the Post may have seen the article, Christine, was that last week that it was in the paper, about a young woman here in Washington, D.C. who is a child prodigy. She's a pianist, and she ended up in your truancy court system because she was missing school for performances and all of the things that go along with being a child prodigy. In Texas, and apparently in DC and in any number of states, there's a mandatory filing system that once a child reaches a certain number of days of absences, there's no discretion in terms of whether or not the school files or doesn't file. Or at least it's treated as though there's no discretion. So in Texas, we hear horror stories all the time about kids who have chronic health issues, kids who have been hospitalized for serious health problems, kids who, in Texas, you can actually be filed on not just for missing a full day of school, but for missing a part of a day. And so there's some schools that will start to count students even if they're just tardy to class. So we've worked with students who have had 10 tardies, but we're at school. So we have an incredibly inflexible system, and that's something that I hear about from advocates in other states as well. It's a system that's not rooted in research. What you heard from Dane and from Vidya is that the research really tells us that when it comes to addressing status offenses and truancy, what you need to do is really look at what is the root of the problem. Why is the kid not getting to school? Quite often it's something that is fixed pretty easily. It may be a transportation problem. It may be that the kid doesn't have money for a school uniform. We hear that all the time in Texas. Things that can be fixed pretty easily. Sometimes it's more complex, but it's something that really needs more of a social services approach than a punitive court or juvenile system approach. The other thing that we hear quite often and that we come up against as a barrier in Texas when we talk about reform is that educators often don't feel like they have any role once the child is truant. They feel very divorced from that system, and we've had many conversations with both our state education agency and with local educators about truancy, and often their first response is, that's not something we deal with, that's not really our problem. So we need to do a better job of making sure that schools are understanding that they are a part of this system and that they have a very crucial role in making sure that kids don't end up in the court system.
Thank you, Dr.
Yes, well, I could probably project on what I said. But yeah, I'm Mark Levin with the Texas Public Policy Foundation and Right on Crime, and it's a pleasure to be here. We've worked on this for several years, both in Texas and throughout the country. And obviously, we kind of come at it from a perspective of the conservative approach that we bring to our whole host of issues. And those of you that aren't familiar with Right on Crime, you've probably seen that we have a statement of principles that's been signed by many conservative leaders, from Jeb Bush to Newt Gingrich to Ed Meese, the former Attorney General. So really, I think that's the great thing about this issue, as Senator Casey observed, that it really brings people together because the principles of limited government, personal responsibility, protecting taxpayers, and frankly, getting results. And one thing we know is that locking up kids for minor offenses actually often makes them worse because it separates them from their families, from their churches, from other community associations that can be positive in their lives, in the school, most importantly, perhaps. So we have really made a lot of progress in Texas on the issue of kids being given citations, Class C misdemeanors for minor misbehavior, even things like chewing gum in class. We got rid of that. But we have this problem with truancy and other status offenses, not only in Texas, but across the country. And so really what I would tell you is that over 10,000 kids nationally are locked up because of these status offenses. And if you look at it, it's disproportionately kids in certain, fit certain profiles, including, for example, special education use. And a lot of times those issues are not properly diagnosed. And so we're really treating the symptoms rather than the roots of what's going on. One of the things I'd really like to focus on is the alternatives we could use and are being used in many jurisdictions in lieu of locking kids up. And first of all, I think it starts with the school. There's a program in Fort Bend County, a county outside of Texas, where if the kid isn't there by second period, someone goes out to the home and figures out what's going on if they're not answering the phone. And in one case, the kid needed clothes, so they got him clothes and they solved the problem. And so we actually passed a law several years ago that said police could just bring the kids to school instead of bringing them to juvenile detention, which certainly seemed like a common sense thing to do. One of the bizarre things we have in Texas, and I'm sure this is true in some other states, one of the penalties for truancy, in addition to the referral to municipal court, as Deborah discussed, is out-of-school suspension, where truly, therefore, the penalty for not going to school is that you can't come to school. So we're hoping to repeal that next session. But some of the other things, civil citations, which they're using in Florida to do community service and things like that, day and evening reporting centers for kids that need more intervention, electronic monitoring. And we shouldn't throw a GPS thing on every child, but for those that are perpetually truant, where you've tried just about everything else, it's certainly better than putting them in a cell somewhere. And then for a lot of the other things we see with status offenses, whether it's minor in possession of alcohol or things like that, police diversion, where the police can have some place to refer a child to instead of bringing them to juvenile detention. There's a program in Tarrant County, which is Fort Worth, with the Lena Pope Home, which is a nonprofit, and they've had just off-the-charts results. And what happens is the police make a referral to the parent of the child, and this is not just for status offenses, but other misdemeanors involving children, to go there where they have 90 days of attending classes, both the parent and the child go, and if they complete those classes, then the case never goes to the prosecutor. It's never filed. And frankly, it makes prosecutors' jobs a lot easier as well. And various other interventions, including functional family therapy, multisystemic therapy, and so forth. So I think one of the things we need to do is look at what's driving, what's going on. I think Deborah alluded to this. In Dallas, the truancy court has collected $2.9 million, just in 1 year. And that's with 36,000 kids coming through this one truancy court. And if you look at the performance measures for Dallas County, they publish all of them. The only performance measure for the truancy court is how much money they collect. It's not a performance measure whether the kids actually come out better off, whether they attend school more, correct their behavior. So that's a real problem. And so another issue I think that is a concern is the schools know that a lot of the kids that are truant and have other status offenses, they're the kids least likely to pass a standardized test, and they're graded every year by the state, and this is true in almost every state. So it's somewhat convenient for them if those kids are not there to take those tests. So we have to look at that as well. And then finally, I will tell you that I think a lot of the issue with the over-incarceration of status offenders has to do with the failures of our child welfare system throughout the country. We have heard from many juvenile agencies that the child welfare system is called to pick up a child from juvenile detention, and they just don't show up. And so this kid, whether they're there for a status offense or having a joint, they're not a threat to public safety, but they're languishing in detention. And I really think that, of course, when you get into issues of a parent saying their child is ungovernable and things like that, you've got to look at, well, how can we address what may be issues in terms of the parenting and try to strengthen the family. Ultimately, we believe the law is the weakest form of social control. The strongest form is the family, followed by civil society. And so we need to strengthen those levers rather than just relying on the law and incarceration.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the school to prison pipeline, and I think it's a perfect framework for the conversation that we're having about status offenses. My name is Thena Robinson-Mock, and I serve as project director of Advancement Project's Ending the Schoolhouse to Jailhouse Track program. And Advancement Project is a national civil rights organization based here in DC. We've been around since 1999, and we've been looking at this issue of zero tolerance policies and practices that criminalize youth of color in schools for some time now. And the growing trend of 3 strikes you're out kinds of policies, zero tolerance. All of this is a way to sort of bring in the criminal justice element inside of the classroom. And, you know, I often think about my grandmother, who was a retired teacher and guidance counselor. And if she could see what young people are being arrested for at school today, I think she would be shocked. Because what would normally wind up, a behavior that might end up in the principal's office these days will lead you out of the school in handcuffs. And when I think about this, you know, in Louisiana, that's where I got my start practicing law. I was so incredibly disturbed to see 11-year-olds shackled and handcuffed in a courtroom. That's an image that will always disturb me. It's an image that I refuse to accept as normal, and so should you. We should all be deeply disturbed at the very notion that a school day could be interrupted by handcuffs or a trip to the courthouse for something that in many cases is not really a crime. And so the data on this issue is quite disturbing and indicates that there are some clear racial disparities as it relates to who is getting suspended and expelled and arrested at school. So 70% of students involved in a school-related arrest or who are referred to law enforcement are African American or Latino. And in addition to school-based arrests, young people are excluded from the classroom in the form of out-of-school suspensions. A crazy, ridiculous number, 3 million per year are suspended, and that includes youth of color and students with disabilities. And just one out-of-school suspension in the 9th grade doubles a student's risk of dropping out before graduation. And I think when we think about all of the countless hours of time that young people are out of the classroom, it's absolutely related to academic achievement. And when we look at discipline, when we look at the criminalization of young people of color and students overall, this is a priority for us, and we have to fix it. And so the kinds of things that young people are getting pushed out of classroom for are things like hugging a friend, hugging a teacher, in Maryland, chewing a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun, in Florida, science experiment gone wrong, uniform violations, hairstyles even. And there was a very disturbing number that came out in March that talked about how preschoolers are now being suspended disproportionately. So Black children represent 18% of the preschool enrollment, but 48% of preschool children receiving more than one out-of-school suspension. And it's challenging to think about what a 4-year-old could do to be sent home. I mean, we could say temper tantrum, but that's pretty much in the 4-year-old's job description. And so, you know, these are the trends that we're seeing in our classroom that are sort of leading our young people onto this path of the school-to-prison pipeline. And so for the past 15 years, Advancement Project has worked alongside grassroots community organizations in places around the country, youth, parents, concerned community members, educators, juvenile judges, to try to come up with collaborative strategies to end these kinds of policies and practices, and also to change the relationship between young people and police and schools. You know, one challenge that we have is that we know that historically communities of color have had challenges with the relationship between their relationship with law enforcement officers, and so that creates hostile interactions in school. And what we advocate for is a limitation on the role of police intervention. We believe that educators, counselors, supportive staff are the best folks to handle any kind of disciplinary infraction, and not a police officer. So just a couple of quick examples of some pretty effective strategies. Judge Stephen Teskey in Clayton County, Georgia, has been a leader in efforts to push back on the use of school-based arrests, and also to push back on the kinds of infractions that come before a judge. Also, Chief Judge Chanley Kuhn in Delaware, retired Judge Judith Smith-Kay in New York. So juvenile judges can play a critical role in this, as can district attorneys, public defenders, the whole community, probation officers. And in Broward County, Florida, one of the 6 largest school districts in the nation, had sweeping reforms this past year when they decided to get together and collaboratively work on a memorandum of understanding around discipline infractions in schools. So they got together and said, you know what, we have a crisis as it relates to school discipline and arrests. Let's figure out how we can transform this in our schools. Let's come up with an agreement so that we can draw a bright line on who gets pushed out of school. Also, in 2013, a community group, Padres y Jóvenes Unidos in Denver, Colorado, helped to negotiate a groundbreaking agreement, and these are young youth, youth leaders of color working on this issue to require training for officers in schools to also limit the use of out-of-school suspensions. So there are wonderful examples around the country of grassroots efforts, and young people and parents can be the best partners for lawmakers who are looking to implement these changes, particularly young people who have been directly impacted. And as we heard from our panel before us, who better to tell that story and advocate than those who are most impacted? So I will wrap up, but the last thing that I will say is restorative practices. That is a term that we need to get real comfortable with and real familiar with. Restorative practices are the opposite of zero tolerance, and there are some incredible trends happening around the country where instead of pushing young people out of school, we take the time to implement conflict resolution measures to actually get at the root of the problem and keep kids in school. And these are the kinds of policies that we can do. We can work on those together, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thanks to all of our panelists. Well, and on that last point that Athena made, on the Vera website, I think, is a webinar that we just held on the use of restorative practices with status offenders that's still available for folks if you want to see that. And I think just again, for all of you here in the room and thinking about this from a national perspective, resources are challenging, and I think that that's one of the themes that has come up quite a bit in terms of how can jurisdictions approach these challenging issues in a smart, efficient, and cost-effective way. But as Dane has mentioned, there are communities that are doing it, and doing things the right way doesn't have to mean additional resources. It's doing things more efficiently, which could end up with savings, but also could just more importantly end up with better outcomes. I also think through some of the other examples that Deborah and Mark raised, you think these stories could be outliers, the example of a young person ending up in court because their alarm clock didn't work. But I think that what it really touches upon is that there's a system breakdown going on between schools, criminal justice agencies, and our other parts of the child welfare agency systems. And so coming up in this series that we'll have further discussion about how these agencies can work together, what are some levers and national leadership that can happen to try and set the tone for the right policy approaches. And I also think, as Athena mentioned, there are some jurisdictions that are figuring out these challenges in a very creative, effective way that can perhaps be lifted up by a lot of your offices to think about the ways that some of these problems that have gone on for generations. All of us were teenagers. Everybody makes mistakes. I think the questions for the communities are how are you planning to respond to them? So we really appreciate that everyone was able to join us here today for this conversation. And I apologize because of the way that our room's set up that it seems more like a hearing where our panel is up here and you're all over there. And it's not just around the table, but we're very welcome to have any of your questions at this time. I also really encourage any of you who want to stick around and have one-on-one conversations with any of our youth and other panelists that were here today. It's a chance to get to know them and hopefully continue this conversation as part of your ongoing work. Any questions right now, or would folks prefer to have an opportunity to reach out directly with some of the folks that were on our panel? Well, again, I just want to really thank all of you for getting here. It's not an easy accomplishment knowing that this is your last day in this work period. We appreciate your attention and your willingness to hear from a wide range of perspectives about these issues. As I mentioned, we're going to be back here again in just a couple of weeks, and we've actually got a very aggressive schedule set out in hopes that for staff who are around over the next month, there's an opportunity to come and have conversations about how the national conversation around youth justice can be ignited again. I will say, on the House side, there hasn't been action on the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act for a very long time. Here in the Senate, some of you may recall the last time it passed out of the Senate Judiciary Committee was in 2008. There's conversations that the bill may be reintroduced soon. But in addition to that, as Senator Casey mentioned earlier, and as many of you may know, there have been other legislative proposals introduced by Senator Booker and Senator Rand Paul and others that I think hopefully what we want to try and do is create a conversation that enables you to take a hard look at those bills and see where your individual offices may need additional resources or research or examples from your own home states, we're happy to be a resource to you. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and thanks again to our panelists for their incredible remarks. Thanks so much, guys.